You've had areas that have maybe not grown so fast and other areas that have been newly introduced and grown and done really well, such as gaming.
Actually, our biggest R&D hub is in Malta, and actually it's because of sort of how attractive it is to have our team here.
What you'll see is that each area of the economy has been growing.
Welcome to a very interesting panel discussion from the series of Tech Talks Beyond Borders. This is being brought to you by TechMT and Meet Inc. I'm Vanessa MacDonald. With me today I have Nick Kaptur, who is the International Tax Partner at Deloitte, but also the President of the Institute for Financial Services Practitioners, the IFSP. We also have David Grima, who is the Director of Product Innovation at TrustStamp, and you'll be able to tell us what that does in a moment, and Theo Dix, who is the strategy for EY Parthenon in Malta. So you look after all the strategy?
Yes, I look after our strategy business.
Yes. Okay, perhaps we can start with a very, very brief introduction to what your companies do. David, can you explain to us what TrustStamp actually does?
Sure. So TrustStamp is a privacy-first identity company. So we essentially are in the business of identity verification, but also identity matching. Obviously, identity is a very hot topic because unlike passwords, you can't change your face or biometric, whatever you're using to sign on or sign in to your bank account or to your applications. And so we make sure that we are doing that in a privacy-first approach.
In fact, data protection is very much something that we will be talking about later on, because when you're talking about digital and technology-enabled companies, then obviously this is quite a big concern for everybody. Nick, perhaps you can give us a brief introduction to Deloitte and also your role at IFSP.
Sure, good morning. So Deloitte is obviously one of the big four accounting firms, and we obviously provide the full range of sort of accounting, audit, taxation, consulting, risk advisory services. My own involvement is on the tax side, and particularly in international tax. So sometimes I do find myself on the front line of attracting FDI into Malta, because normally that's part of the conversation about understanding the pros and cons of being here.
And over to you, Theo.
So I lead EY Parthenon, which is the strategy consulting arm of EY's offering. We are now the fourth largest strategy consultancy in the world, so competing with the likes of McKinsey, BCG and Bain, in many places across the globe. And in my own role, I work in two parts. I help private sector businesses with corporate strategy, growth initiatives, value creation, transformation work. And I also do a lot of work on the policy side as well. And that's where I guess all the links into FDI and tech come in.
Fantastic. Well, today, strictly speaking, we're here to talk about retaining tech-related FDI in Malta. And one of the first questions that we were going to discuss, which we were discussing during the preamble, was, are we successful in attracting FDI and also in retaining FDI? And even on this point, we were having quite an interesting debate. Why? I think it's interesting to look at how the economy of Malta has evolved over the last couple of years. And perhaps one of the misconceptions that we have is that manufacturing has gone down and been replaced by other things, whereas in fact what's happening is, if you look at the FDI from 2011, for example, it was 135 million. It's now, in 2021, it was close to $1 billion, and in 2022 it was 500 million, so $500 million there. So manufacturing is still actually there. What's happened is that a lot of new things like gaming, financial and insurance investment and so on have come into Malta. Theo, you were a little bit concerned that this might be misleading. Can you explain to us what you see the situation as now?
No, I wouldn't say it's misleading at all. I think what I was talking about before, Vanessa, was really, I think that our core sectors have remained strong. So I think manufacturing's remained strong and continues to remain strong. I think over the years, Malta's had, Malta's skill set in the sector has been highly regarded. I think activities have transformed from low-skilled manufacturing activities to high-tech manufacturing activities. But the country's also been successful in diversifying its economy into other areas as well. I think we've built a very, very strong gaming sector, probably the leading global hub of gaming. And there's opportunities, I think, to really kind of build upon that as we've started to do in other areas, be it technology, IT, financial services, insurance, payments, and other areas, and to continue to expand upon that. So I think what we've done is, I guess, continue to invest in our core activities and also diversify beyond that. And I think if you look at the statistics over the years, what you'll see is that each area of the economy has been growing. And I think we continue to grow and continue to grow. I guess the challenge is to what extent can we continue to grow as a country,
we need to
given
understand
we've got limited space
at what point, yes.
and limited people.
Nick, what is your take on this?
I think the economic performance of Malta has been incredible. Most other countries have sort of peaks and troughs, and Malta just seems to have sort of low growth or high growth, but it's always been growth. So that's, combined with the diversification of the economy, that's great for people who live here. And it's been quite interesting to see because, as you said, things like manufacturing haven't disappeared. Some of the scarce stories, if you like, haven't really come through. So you've had areas that have maybe not grown so fast and other areas that have been newly introduced and grown and done really well, such as gaming. It's been an interesting ride, that's for sure.
Yes. We certainly also have a lot of manufacturing companies which have stayed here, and even homegrown ones that are now internationalizing and really have got a presence internationally. And I think that is something, maybe when we're talking about the technology sector or technology-enabled, is very important. Why?
I think what we're starting to see is that, especially in taking manufacturing as a sector, there's more and more investment into R&D, technology, and Malta's actually starting to...
Which is all value-added.
Yes, it's all value-added activity, and Malta's starting to actually attract that sort of investment as well, largely by companies already based here expanding into other areas. And I think that's quite an interesting concept as well. And I think there's always a lot of talk around attracting more FDI. I think there's also a lot of opportunity around working with our existing companies on the ground, and we've got a lot of international companies here already and a lot of strong local companies, and helping them expand into adjacent sort of business activities on the ground over here.
If I may add to this, actually, so we're a global company and we've got a few offices around the world. But actually our biggest R&D hub is in Malta, and actually it's because of sort of how attractive it is to have our team here, because A, we've got a lot of skilled people here, but B, because we're such a small island, it just makes sense because connections are way easier.
The hardest thing is to get people to come here in the first place. Once they've come to Malta, set up, and they're experiencing Malta, expanding and doing other activities through Malta can generally be quite successful, and it's almost like an adjacent sort of expansion that they will probably buy into relatively easily. The really tough thing is getting people, I know, in New York who have never thought of Malta or doing business in Malta to actually come over here, consider what can be done, and then actually, press the go button and go ahead with something over here.
Yesterday we were talking about TechMT's role, for example, and the series of events that are being organised called In Malta, which are taking, different aspects of the Maltese economy and promoting them. So I think these promotional agencies have got a major role to play in this.
I think spreading the Malta word out there is critically important by any of the agencies, all of the agencies, because Malta is just not on the radar, really and truly. People have to be, they have to discover it. It has to be pointed out, and then some of the pros and cons have to be discussed, and that's quite a mission.
I think on that, what's quite interesting is I think the ability for digital businesses to really kind of amplify Malta's global reach. I think once you've got success stories, you've got, I guess, in the age of social media and the like, you can attract attention pretty easily. And you mentioned the US, and it's funny. My partner's from the US, and when she first came here, she was just amazed at how old everything is, all our history, all our things, and for them everything's amazing. Like for us it's relatively normal, and I think even for a lot of Europeans it's relatively normal, but Americans just get amazed when we come here. And even if we had to scratch the very, 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 very tip of the iceberg in a country like America, the amount of business activity that could generate over here is huge. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think these agencies like TechMT definitely have a role to play in bringing that visibility around Malta.
We talked about the success of bringing people here, but what about retaining them? David, you've had a couple of stories where things did not perhaps go so well. What happened?
Yeah, so we've been here for 4 years. So we opened up here in Malta in 2020. And during the past 4 years, we've seen at least 2 companies that we know of who we work closely with in other countries, and it just made sense that they open up here. They started the process, but then a lot of stumbling blocks started to happen. There were a lot of hiccups. The process was too slow, too costly, because a lot of due diligence needed to be repeated across different professional services providers. And so that was a big sort of red flag to them, in the sense that they were wasting a lot of money and time to open up here, whereas maybe in another country you can just set up a company in a few days.
But isn't that one of the things that we boast about? That, everything is so small and accessible, and, getting you in touch with your regulator takes days, etc. Is that not actually the experience for people?
I think local companies experience the ease of doing business, but I think some foreign companies maybe are treated differently, or at least it's quite difficult to know the right person you need to get to if you're opening up shop and you're trying to opening up, let's say, from New York, and you've never been to Malta. There is this thing where if you're a foreign company, and obviously if you're a gaming company and you've got millions in your books, if you're faced with the threat of a 20, 30, 40,000 euro fine,
it's not really
I think.
Not
but
a
with an
game changer.
SME, with a smaller company, I mean, you're tight on money all the time. And so I think things need to be more efficient, maybe.
And this is, in fact, one of the things which has come out, in fact, from the attractiveness survey published by EY every year, that sometimes bureaucracy can be quite stifling.
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure. And I think the government is now starting to recognise this. So within some of the initiatives, a reduction in bureaucracy is actually now being spoken of as a desired outcome. The only thing is it's easier to say than to actually do it, because there are so many agencies involved, so many rules and regulations, and many people now will sort of say, well, this is a requirement, and it's not because I want to, I have to. I would like to see a situation whereby subject persons can take more of a risk-based approach, and if something is within sort of normal risk parameters, perhaps they don't need to get, for argument's sake, 20 documents, but sort of could rely on sort of a smaller number of documents. That would be one thing. The other thing is that in the EU, there are initiatives going on to set up AMLA, which is an anti-money laundering agency, and that should be having more of a level playing field across Europe. So at the moment, many of our clients actually say the documentation requirements in Malta are far more onerous than we experience anywhere else. And that is probably true. And that's a little surprising, and maybe it's a legacy of grey listing. However, if it becomes more even across the EU, then at least we can actually say, no, we have working experience of these documentation requirements, and we were sort of like, front runners, and now everybody else is the same. So what is currently maybe a disadvantage can hopefully then become a more
One of the
level
MFSAC strategy points was, in fact, one of the action points, to create a sort of a personal wallet where you can upload your certificates and have them shared by different entities, no?
I mean, Nick and I both sit in these council meetings, and I think 50% of the discussions are really kind of focused on that. So
on
I think
bureaucracy.
but I think on initiatives to actually address it. So I think really
solutions.
what's really positive is I think there's been a concerted effort by various regulatory authorities to really look at how technology can be used to enhance, processes, but also to design the processes as well, to redesign the processes as well. So it's not to effectively say, okay, this is our current process, here's a piece of technology, use that to simplify things, but rather what do we need to do to streamline and enhance efficiencies around that. I think it's quite interesting to see that the Malta Business Register, as you were saying, is trying to do that on the KYC front. You've got the MFSA embarking on a major initiative to, again, really sort of redesign all the regulatory processes to bring digital technologies into that. You've got the tax authorities, again, who have announced to do something similar. So I think it's really, encouraging.
It's actually an exciting time
it's
to be here,
to see that I think there's a concerted drive by everybody to understand that, look, there are these pain points and we need to address them if we are to remain, and be more competitive as a country.
I'm going to take the elephant in the room, which is taxation, because we know that whether we like it or not, the taxation systems are going to have to abide by the OECD rules, etc. And so it's going to happen whether we like it or not. Have we managed to increase, you mentioned pain points, for example, have we managed to make the rest of the ecosystem robust enough for there to be competitive advantages besides merely taxation?
Taxation does not exist in isolation, so taxation is one of the hooks, perhaps, to come to Malta, and is necessary because Malta is a microeconomy on the edge of Europe. So you have some disadvantages due to your market size and your geographic location, and therefore you do need to use other incentives such as taxation to help compensate for that. So taxation is not something that you necessarily want to give away or can give away, but obviously if the rule set changes and if the bar raises across Europe or across the world, you mentioned the OECD, then clearly you just make sure that you are relatively competitive within the new kind of environment. I think, and only just yesterday, there were some pronouncements by the Minister of Finance. The view is that Malta's tax system will not have shocks to it, that it will evolve more gradually. There are some exemptions that Malta, can invoke and will use, and it is not in Malta's interest to shock the system. On the other hand, we are members of the EU, and we have to abide by the rules as well.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this episode on Meet Inc., powered by TechMT.
Malta is actually a really good stepping stone, not only for the European market, but also for the African market.
People are coming from New York, Asia, different places. They said they've never seen an ecosystem as supportive as Malta.
Malta is just not on the radar, really and truly. People have to discover it.
Welcome back to Tech Talks Beyond Borders. This is the second part of our foreign direct investment episode. One of the points which was raised in the first session of these TechMT and Meet Inc. talks was the lack of venture capital, etc. And one of the issues that I'd like to dig into a little bit is this idea of growth, internationalization, and so on. We've got very, very low mergers and acquisitions in Malta. And at a recent discussion, one of the points made by one of the panelists was that we have a lot of family-owned companies here who don't even have succession planning, let alone the ability to let go enough to share that with a merger or international investment company. Is that a big problem?
You have a lot of privately owned businesses in Malta. I mean, even if you look at the stock market has really had mostly debt issues rather than equity issues. So companies have remained very privately held. I think it would be great to see that transform over time. I think it would be great to see private equity or venture capital come in and play a part in that. I would be realistic. I don't expect the very big global houses to come up and set up Malta branches and be active in Malta. But I think Maltese businessmen, Maltese families might be interested perhaps in contributing to a fund if there were some very good tax incentives that sort of helped offset the risk, and if there was a management system that sort of could cater for that. And then that would then be a Malta venture capital house, if you like, that would invest in Maltese startups and Maltese tech businesses. That could be really interesting.
The seed investment rules that we've got in place over here, I think, when I looked at them 5-6 years ago, I think the one challenge that shone out was that effectively, there wasn't a mechanism to enable people to invest in a fund type structure to benefit from those tax advantages. And again, also the size of the startups that were eligible under that scheme were extremely small. So I guess earlier you invest, the more risk there is and the less likely you're going to get any of your money back. So I think if you're trying to encourage people to invest in different stages, to invest into startups, I think there needs to be some awareness around how do you mitigate some risk within the portfolio. And I think, as Nick was saying, potentially having some fund type structures could be interesting. I think we do need to be realistic, as Nick was saying. I mean, you're talking about the lack of venture capital and private equity in Malta. I mean, I have a regional role covering 29 countries across Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I mean, there isn't a lot of venture capital in many markets. I mean, taking Poland, for example, as sort of one of the larger markets in my region, again, there isn't a huge amount over there either. We've got some family offices in Central Europe which are starting to look into this, same in Turkey. But again, realistically, I mean, most venture capital sits in sort of, the biggest cities across the world. And Malta just doesn't have the deal flow. I mean, you mentioned the lack of M&A. I mean, the majority of businesses in Malta, I mean, sort of traditional Maltese businesses, have focused on Maltese business activities. I mean,
how many of them
they're tiny.
Internationally, yes.
What interest is there for a lot of them, for somebody coming from outside, really, to look at a business the size of a Maltese one? So I think what's interesting is now this changing dimension around having, I guess, digital businesses looking outwards and looking at sort of, the opportunities on a European market, on a global market. And that's where you see interest, and that's where you've seen some M&A activities come in, where, Maltese companies focusing on global markets actually have been acquired and continue to grow.
Malta is actually a really good stepping stone, not only for the European market, but also for the African market. A lot of countries in Africa are sort of starting to become increasingly polarized, and they're either aligning with US, UK, or BRICS. And Malta actually, I think, is the only country which is both an EU member, but also a Commonwealth member, now that obviously UK has left the bloc. And so that lands us in a very sort of peculiar position where we're obviously neutral. And so we are, in a way, looked at more positively in these African countries that we're starting to do business in because we're neutral. And so we have the ability to come in and say, we're going to work with you, but we're also going to work with you.
And I think likewise even with the Middle East, because we have a certain amount of cultural and language affinity.
How interesting. David, I need to ask you, please, to give us a little bit of insight into this issue of data protection, but also with cybersecurity. How much of an issue is it?
GDPR is a trailblazer, you could say. So in a way, that's a good thing because that means that if we're going to abide by GDPR, then the cost of doing business in other countries outside of Europe is sort of mitigated because we're already abiding to the highest standards. Because of GDPR and all the other privacy laws, we had to have a legal in-house team in Malta. That's also created opportunities for us and also new jobs. So it's a win-win in a way.
Is artificial intelligence the answer or the problem?
Bit of both, I would say. I think AI can help us solve a lot of problems, but AI is still it's in infancy, not in the sense that, models have been around for decades now. But I think letting models operate in the wild is too unsafe, especially when we're dealing with financial institutions, when we're dealing with highly private or secure things. So I think there must be human oversight.
We're a tiny country, and I think we've got a lot of opportunity really to harness our ability to be a test bed. I was very...
Would you believe that the digital survey actually found that we have more ICT specialists in Malta than the EU average? It's so nice for us to be above the EU average.
Very, very strong technology skills. And as a country, I think we've been successful in testing technology and piloting technology in the past. There's a lot we can do now. What's quite interesting was if you look at Malta's AI strategy was published in 2018, 2019, the whole concept around that was really using Malta as a launch pad, a testing bed for applied AI. So for people to come here, apply AI in a particular area, see if they can demonstrate some success and then use that as a bit of a launching pad across the world. And it's interesting to see a tech accelerator that recently ran a program in Malta, and I think there were 12 startups, 14 startups, 8 or 10 of them had something to do with AI. And again, they really found the ecosystem in Malta super conducive to what they wanted to do, because again, to come and test some technologies over here in a safe way is really easy to do. The ecosystem's super supportive. People were coming from New York, Asia, different places. They said they've never seen an ecosystem as supportive as Malta. I think what we need to then do as a country, if we want to really kind of harness these opportunities, is look at what are the building blocks to make that work. I think we need to recognize as a country that we need to see data as an asset. You mentioned GDPR. Our regulatory authorities need to have all, the money at their disposal to hire best of breed people in the country and build significant teams. I don't think you can have, small teams of a couple of people and then saying, we want to use ourselves as a country to kind of pilot this or pilot that. But AI regulation should probably be an opportunity for companies coming outside of Europe, looking at Malta as maybe a place where they can get comfortable with regulation. We're also seeing it on the blockchain side with MiCAR as well, where I think if we're actually fast and we've got sort of the right structures in place and the right investments around certain things, we can do things. But we need to look at it in a holistic way and say, okay, if we want to be a pilot site and use anything kind of data-driven, let's make sure we build out all the infrastructure around that to make that possible. And I think it needs to have, a holistic vision around this rather than a siloed vision where we say, okay, we like this, but then, the other 3 parts of the puzzle don't fit together. I think that's where maybe we need to get a little bit better as a country.
Nick, I understand the IFSP has actually done a study which might be interesting, yes?
Yes, so the IFSB had actually done a study in 2022 by eCubed, which was really to assess how important is foreign direct investment to the Maltese economy. And it came up with some interesting facts, which essentially show that it's about 10% of the economy directly, but that increases to about 18-19% when you take the direct and indirect effects. It has relatively higher value added per employee, so I think it is also important as we choose to grow our economy. As you mentioned earlier, there are limitations of size. So of course, if something is a higher value add, then you want to really try and grow that because it allows the economy to grow without proportionately harming maybe the built-up environment and the intensity of Malta. It's also helpful in that in today's environment where we're more environmentally aware, of course, from a carbon footprint point of view. These are jobs that have relatively low carbon footprint, and they so that's also beneficial. What it did pick up, and this is something that we can maybe focus on over time, is whilst it creates lots of good career opportunities, women in this area were probably slightly underrepresented. So I think that's also maybe a cultural, historic legacy of Malta that we should be focusing on to unwind.
This issue of human resources is something that we also encounter on a daily basis. We are looking at an economic model which is reliant on imported labour at the moment. And obviously we have to see where this goes going forward, which is certainly not a decision that any of us here around the table would need to make. How do you see it? I mean, do you think that tech-enabled future, investment and so on would help us when it comes to this choice really for locals as well as people coming in?
Where do we begin? It's a big conversation. It's a really big conversation.
I know, but we only have a few minutes left.
In the past, Malta used to sort of import labour maybe at the very high levels to the foreigner who teaches the Maltese, and then the foreigner leaves and the Maltese take over. Now the foreigners are doing the jobs the Maltese don't want to do, and we're almost victims of our own success. I think we need to get the balance right. There's definitely, we are a multicultural society and we want to be an international society. It's great when you see people integrated here and actually attracting more business from their home countries and saying, hey, look, Malta's really successful. Come and see what's going on. So that's great. Obviously, on the other hand, we can't have towers everywhere and we can't be all built up. The Malta we know and love has certain features that we would like to retain, and we would like to get the balance right.
I think that's interesting because, we've just done a study on infrastructure. Looking at the infrastructure gap and just trying to extrapolate, current data. But it's interesting. You're seeing, roughly 20,000 new people coming into the country every year. If you keep on extrapolating that looking forward, you wonder how many people is Malta going to have, what's Malta's population size
and the falling birth rate is not going to make up for that, is it?
No, definitely.
It's not going to change things enough.
So what's Malta's population going to be in 20 years' time, 30 years' time? And then what infrastructure do we need to kind of cope with that? And I think, the question is there a plan around that to really kind of address that? But going back to, the tech opportunities, I think the nice thing is, having these tech businesses in Malta, operating from Malta, creates all sorts of career opportunities for the young. Now, Nick and I both work for Big Four firms. I think, historically, going into a career in a Big Four firm was, one of those the showcase kind of career choices. I was speaking to somebody, they were saying, the number of accountants going to first year university is now 100 people in first year, so probably 70 by the time they qualify.
And to add to that, actually, our experience has been quite positive in the sense that to attract highly skilled workers to come to Malta, relocate to Malta, it's actually been quite plain sailing. So we've got a lot of things going for us. So we've got fantastic weather, great climate all year round. Everything's within walking distance or driving distance unless you're stuck in traffic. But again, we've got a lot of benefits that we don't necessarily see because we've been here for years and years. But attracting talent to Malta has been easy. Mostly, I think the biggest reason is because English is one of our main languages. And so it's quite easy for them to consider relocating here.
And it's obviously very important that we emphasize that and we retain that. But it's interesting that you say it's easy, because I've had some experiences which have shown that it's quite challenging to get people to Malta to relocate. And I think our experience has been that Malta is a bit of a Marmite place. You either love it or hate it. And it depends what background you come from. If you're used to living in a huge city, then Malta is going to be very different. If you're used to living in a suburb, then Malta could be amazing. So sometimes people have to come here and they will figure out quite early on whether they love it or hate it. The only problem is for a company, then that's quite an expensive process in terms of relocation and taking a chance on them or whatever.
And also your timelines are lengthy.
Yeah, because you need to know whether you're getting someone in position or not. I do think, though, that we need to listen to the Maltese who leave a little bit more. So many Maltese are studying abroad, and that's a good thing. And it's something that we anticipated when we joined the EU and as we plug in more to the global world. But sometimes they leave and they don't come back, and they would always have a natural connection with Malta. So we need to listen as to why is Malta not being as attractive to them, because Because I think in an ideal world, we listen and we make Malta attractive, and they go and have their experiences abroad, and then they come back and enrich the country with those experiences.
I think that international perspective is super important. I mean, Nick, I've worked abroad, you've worked abroad. I think a number of us have worked abroad and come back. And I think being able to bring those international perspectives back into the country is really helpful, I guess, taking the country forward. But as you're saying, we need to make sure that Malta is an attractive place for them to work, to live. And I think hopefully, some of these new tech businesses coming to the island at least create some different types of job opportunities from what was here before. And hopefully that can help with that.
Gosh, we've managed to cover an awful lot of very insightful pieces. We've talked about everything from data protection to human resources, the makeup of the economy, and obviously the value added. I can't thank you enough. I think we could carry on talking for hours, but I think we're probably going to have to wrap it up for today. So thank you very much for being with us and for following us. And thank you very much to Tech MT and to Meet Inc. for bringing us all together.